The house felt unbearably quiet after he left, as if the air itself had been holding its breath while he was here and only exhaled when the door clicked shut. I stood in the same spot for several minutes, trying to understand the weight in my chest. It wasn't guilt alone. It wasn't desire alone. It was recognition of what I had allowed, what I had wanted, and what I could never pretend away again. I didn't regret the honesty between us, but I couldn't deny the consequences that came with it. My husband returned home later than usual that evening, tired and distracted the same way he always was. He asked about dinner without noticing the tension in my posture, or the distance in my expression. I watched him move around the kitchen, opening cabinets, checking emails, muttering about deadlines. It was strange how ordinary everything looked while my entire world had quietly shifted hours earlier. I found myself studying him the way someone might study an old photograph, searching for traces of what once felt familiar. I realized how much effort I had spent convincing myself that things would get better, that he would eventually notice the small ways I was fading. He never did. And now, after what had unfolded with Daniel, I couldn't pretend that emotional neglect was normal anymore. Days passed in a quiet blur. I avoided calling or texting Daniel, and he respected the distance, even though it made the silence between us feel like an unanswered question. My thoughts kept looping back to the moment our hands almost touched, the way his voice had softened when he said he cared. I wasn't trying to feed the feelings, I was trying to understand them, trying to understand myself. Eventually, the weight became too much to carry alone. One evening, while my husband sat scrolling through his phone, I told him we needed to talk. He looked up reluctantly, as if I had interrupted something important, though he wasn't doing anything meaningful. I spoke calmly, not accusingly, explaining how unseen I'd felt for years, how disconnected we had become, how I couldn't continue living in a marriage where I felt like a background detail. He grew defensive as expected. He said work had been stressful, that I was overthinking, that marriages go through phases. But even in his explanations there was no real emotion, no fear of losing me, no urgency to fix what was breaking. Just excuses layered over exhaustion. And that told me everything I needed to know. That I didn't mention Daniel. The emotional distance in my marriage existed long before that moment with him. What happened between us was a symptom, not the cause. I simply told my husband the truth. I needed change, whether that meant rebuilding from the ground up or walking away. He didn't give me an answer. Not that night, not the next. His silence was its own response. A few days later, I stepped outside for fresh air, trying to clear my thoughts. As if pulled by some quiet gravity, I found myself messaging Daniel, asking if we could meet, not to cross lines, but to talk openly one last time. He agreed without hesitation, but his reply carried restraint, as if he didn't want to assume anything when we met. He didn't reach for me or expect anything from me. He simply listened. I told him I needed to choose a path for myself, not for him, not for my husband. He nodded with an understanding that felt gentle rather than demanding. He said whatever direction I chose, he wanted it to be one where I didn't shrink to fit someone else's neglect. I thanked him, not for his feelings, not for the tension between us, but for the simple fact that he saw me when I had forgotten how to see myself. When we parted ways, there was no dramatic confession, no impulsive closeness. Just two people acknowledging a truth that changed them both. As I walked home, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. The moment I caught him that evening wasn't a mistake. It was the moment that exposed the cracks I had ignored for too long. I didn't know exactly where my path would lead, but for the first time in years, I knew it would be a path I chose for myself. The figure stayed still for a moment, just beyond the reach of the sunlight streaming through the barn walls. She could hear the faint scrape of his boots against the wooden floor, steady, deliberate, each movement drawing her attention despite herself. She tried to focus on the task that had brought her here, the old garden tools stacked haphazardly near the back, but her hands trembled slightly, betraying her inner distraction. Something about the presence of this man made the air heavier, thicker, as though it was charged with energy she couldn't name. He moved closer, slowly, deliberately, without a word. The faint scent of his cologne mixed with the earthy smell of hay, brushing against her senses in a way that made her heart skip. She felt a shiver run down her spine and caught herself fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve, suddenly aware of how quiet the barn had become, how every tiny sound, her breathing, the shuffle of her shoes, felt amplified. Her mind raced, warning her, Yet every instinct she had about safety or loyalty seemed to fight with an equal, unexplainable pull toward him that he bent to pick up one of the tools she had come for. His movements careful, almost purposeful. She noticed the strong lines of his hands, how they gripped the worn handle of the shovel, and she had to close her eyes for a moment, trying to calm the unexpected thrum of desire that had lodged in her chest. Her thoughts flickered to her husband, to the vows she had made, to the life she had built, but even as guilt clawed at her, a small guilty curiosity crept in. How had she ended up standing here alone in a barn, with someone who stirred something she wasn't supposed to feel? He straightened, and she caught the faint brush of his arm against hers, accidental, fleeting, yet electric. She flinched and then froze, heart racing. Her body betrayed her rational mind, responding to the slightest touch, the weight of proximity. He said nothing, only held her gaze for a brief instant, and in that silence, the unspoken tension between them thickened. She could feel the pull, the dangerous allure of someone unattainable, someone forbidden. Every step he took closer seemed deliberate, measured, a silent dance she had no choice but to follow. She imagined what it would mean to reach out, to give in to the pull, and instantly recoiled at the thought. The barn, once merely a neutral space, now felt alive with possibility and risk. Her hands gripped the tool tighter, knuckles white, grounding herself while simultaneously feeling the thrill of the unknown. Time seemed suspended as they worked side by side in silence. The small gestures, the brush of his shoulder, the careful handing of a rake, the shared space in such proximity, built tension so thick she could almost taste it. Thoughts of her husband clashed violently with her body's reaction, creating a storm of guilt and desire. Every instinct screamed caution, yet part of her wanted to lean in, wanted to explore what this encounter might mean. Even knowing it was forbidden, she stepped back, subtly, to regain composure, but the tension lingered. The barn seemed smaller, the air heavier, the quiet more profound. He didn't speak, and yet his presence spoke volumes. She realized then that this encounter wasn't just accidental. The energy between them was undeniable, and the pull of temptation had already taken root, waiting for the next moment, the next brush of hands, the next shared silence to push her further toward the line she wasn't supposed to cross. The barn seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing closer, the air thick with unspoken energy. She felt the heat of his presence without seeing his face, the way the space between them seemed charged with every subtle movement. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the tools she had been carrying, but it wasn't just fatigue. It was anticipation, a tension that made her heart race and her breath uneven. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but part of her felt rooted to the spot, drawn forward by something she couldn't name. He moved behind her as she reached for a broom, the proximity sending a shiver down her spine. She could feel his presence in every direction, the subtle pressure of the air shifting as he adjusted his stance. She tried to focus on sweeping, but her mind betrayed her, replaying the brush of his arm against hers, the sound of his movements, the faint warmth she could sense even without seeing him. There was a pull, magnetic and dangerous, and she realized she was no longer simply curious. She wanted him here, wanted this tension to continue, wanted the thrill that came with the risk. That a faint sound, a laugh barely audible, escaped her lips, and she felt the vibration of it against the quiet, mingling with the faint scrape of his boots. He responded not with words but with a shift, a subtle movement that mirrored hers, a silent acknowledgement that neither of them would speak aloud. It was the unspoken language of danger and desire, and it made her pulse quicken in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. She knew she was crossing an invisible line, one she had promised never to approach, yet every second drew her closer. Her hand brushed against a crate as she leaned forward, and for a brief instant, his hand hovered near hers. The air seemed to thicken, and she felt her own hesitation dissolve into an electric anticipation. The barn, filled with dust and shadows, became a private world where the rules of the outside no longer applied. Every sound, every touch, every slight movement created a rhythm she couldn't resist. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, as if the loneliness of her husband's absence had left a space that he was filling with dangerous intensity. She stepped back slightly, catching her breath, but even as she tried to regain composure, the pull remained. Every instinct to flee warred with the thrill of temptation, and she realized she was no longer capable of resisting. Her thoughts flickered to her husband. Loyalty, love, the life they shared. But those images clashed violently with the undeniable connection she felt here, in this barn with someone forbidden. The tension became unbearable, and she let herself lean, just slightly, into the proximity, feeling the electricity that hummed between them. Time lost its meaning. The barn, the tools, the dust, the shadows, all faded into the background as the silent intimacy deepened. Every brush of movement, every shared space, every unspoken acknowledgement pulled her further into a place she had never expected to go. She knew this was dangerous, irreversible, yet it felt inevitable. She felt alive, wanted, and aware of every fleeting heartbeat, every shallow breath, every pulse of temptation that had taken hold. By the time she dared to step back, even slightly, she knew one thing with certainty. The barn had changed her, and nothing would ever feel the same again. The barn was quiet again, but the silence felt different this time, heavy with unspoken words and invisible traces of what had happened. She moved slowly, gathering the tools, her hands still trembling slightly despite the calm she tried to project. The air seemed charged, as if it had absorbed the intensity of the moments before, and every creak of the floorboard beneath her feet reminded her that nothing in this space would ever feel ordinary again. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the warmth of his presence lingered, ghost-like, brushing against her awareness. Even when he had stepped back, her thoughts immediately went to her husband, to the home they had built, to the promises that now felt fragile and distant. A pang of guilt cut through her, sharp and undeniable, yet it mingled with a thrill that refused to dissipate. She realized she had crossed a line, had stepped into something forbidden, and part of her both regretted it and longed to experience it again. The duality of excitement and shame was suffocating, yet intoxicating, leaving her with a complex knot of emotions she wasn't prepared to untangle. She paused near the doorway, glancing at the dust motes dancing in the sunlight, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. The man in the barn had been nothing more than a presence until now, but the intensity of their encounter had left its mark. She could still feel his energy, the closeness, the electricity of the silent communication that had passed between them. Each gesture, each subtle touch, had carried more meaning than words ever could, and the realization that she had willingly stepped into that uncharted territory sent both fear and exhilaration coursing through her. Even as she moved toward the path leading back to the house, she couldn't shake the lingering tension. Every shadow seemed to echo with what had transpired. Every creak in the floor sounded like a reminder of the forbidden closeness she had felt. She tried to focus on mundane thoughts, on the errands that awaited her, on the life that continued outside the barn, but the memory of his presence was insistent, impossible to ignore. It had become a part of her, a secret pulse beneath her skin that she couldn't fully suppress. By the time she reached the house, the quiet of the room seemed almost unbearable, filled with absence and unspoken truths. She carried herself with a semblance of normalcy, moving through the motions of domestic life, yet inside, the tension and desire lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. She knew she would return to the barn, in thought or perhaps in action, because the experience had awakened something she hadn't felt in years. The allure of the forbidden, the danger, the intensity, it was intoxicating, and she understood now that some lines, once crossed, could never truly be uncrossed. She paused at the window, looking toward the barn, sunlight casting long shadows across the property. There was a question in her mind, unspoken, hovering like the dust in the air. What would happen the next time she stepped inside? She didn't know if she would resist or surrender, if guilt would win or temptation would pull her forward again. But she knew one thing with certainty: the barn had changed her, and the man inside it had left an imprint that would linger, silent but undeniable, in every quiet moment of her days ahead.